Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jorge Heine on modern diplomacy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my great pleasure every week to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation some noted expert on some aspect of international affairs, international public policy, global governance. And today I'm pleased to welcome back my friend and colleague, Jorge Heine.
Thank you.
Who's the CG Chair of Global Governance, Professor of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University, and also distinguished fellow here at CG. And today we're talking about modern diplomacy because you and your colleagues, Andrew Cooper and Ramesh Thakur, are about to come out momentarily with a new book called the Oxford Handbook of Modern Diplomacy, a very ambitious effort. So before we talk about modern diplomacy, perhaps we could talk about the book, the Handbook of Modern Diplomacy.
Of course, and of course you have a very good chapter in it on the diplomacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, let me say the following. What triggered this project, which is the biggest publishing project I've ever been involved in, 50 chapters, nearly 1,000 pages, it's a big doorstopper, if you will. There are two sources of this book, if we want to trace them. One of them was the experience of the three of us, Andrew Cooper, Ramesh Thakur, and myself, from our own different professional capacities, in terms of how we saw diplomacy changing. I was lucky to be ambassador in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was president, and later in India when India was opening up. Ramesh was at the United Nations University for many years, and Andrew Cooper, of course, one of the leading writers on diplomacy and has been examining it from many angles for many years. And it struck us that the enormous changes that we are seeing in the practice of diplomacy and the demands of globalization weren't really always being met by the way diplomats practice their craft, nor by the way the practice of diplomacy is taught at diplomatic academies around the world. So we thought it was a good idea to put together in one standalone volume insights into how this very ancient and traditional craft is changing and has been changing over the past 20 or 30 years or so. So that is one source of these changes. The other source comes from our experience here at CG and our work on the G20. It so happened that the three of us were associated with CG from the very beginning, and we were lucky enough to be mandated by Paul Martin shortly before he became Prime Minister with the task of spreading the word about the G20 and what the G20 could do if it was established at leaders level. Paul Martin, of course, had been the first chair of the G20 at finance ministers level as far back as in 1999. And he was very keen to make it happen at leaders level. So he tasked CG to do that, and we all took part very much in that. It was a fascinating experience. A lot of people were skeptical, and they said, this will never happen. The United Nations Security Council will be changed before there is a G20 at leaders level. The United States is not interested. President Bush in particular is adamantly opposed to these so-called talk shops. So it will never happen, don't waste your time. And at the time, I was coming to CG to meetings of the International Board of Governors and going back to Delhi where I was ambassador of Chile and mentioned this to my colleagues, and they said, Jorge, why do you waste your time? This will never happen. Well, lo and behold, as we all know, in November of 2008, it was President Bush himself who called for the first G20 meeting to be held in Washington, D.C. So we were struck by the importance of ideas and how ideas can actually change the way the world is run. And we were keen to look in greater detail into the interaction between ideas on the one hand and praxis and the sort of things you need to do to operationalize these ideas in global governance and in diplomacy. Mm-hmm.
And you've got both scholars and practitioners
represented. That's right.
One
of the things we wanted to do, this book is part of the Oxford Handbooks in Political Science and in International Relations, which is a very notable series. But one of the things we wanted to give this book is our imprint in the sense of not being just having scholars and academics participated, but also bring the perspective of practitioners. So we were lucky enough to have chapters by Paul Martin himself, by Lloyd Axworthy, one of the great foreign ministers Canada has had. We have chapters by Martti Ahtisaari, the former president of Finland and a noted specialist in mediation. We have a chapter by General Juan Emilio Cheire, a former head of the Chilean army and a noted defense intellectual. We have a chapter by a noted British diplomat, Sir Jeremy Greenstock, who was British permanent representative to the United Nations at the time of the Iraq war. So people that bring a wealth of experience to this in their own perspective on how diplomacy is changing. Diplomacy is a field of study, but it is preeminently a craft. So we thought it was very important to bring the perspective of those who actually practice it together with leading specialists and scholars in the field.
Did you have an ideal audience in mind when you
designed
the book?
Yes. We have several audiences in mind. A prime audience, of course, is diplomats themselves. And we are thinking particularly of diplomats in the developing world. It seems to us that many of these changes that are taking place in diplomacy have been assimilated, have been taken on, as it were, in several countries in Western Europe, in North America, but not necessarily with the same verve, the same brio in the global South, where the old traditional model of diplomacy still holds, at least in many countries. So that is, for us, a prime audience. I was lucky enough to be invited by the Foreign Minister of Trinidad a couple of weeks ago to give the keynote address at the Heads of Mission conference that he organized in Port of Spain, and he had all the ambassadors there, and we had a fascinating exchange precisely on this topic and on how diplomacy is changing. So diplomats themselves are a key audience, but obviously the field of diplomatic studies reaches beyond diplomats themselves, and so we think that this will also be of interest for scholars, for journalists, for students, and there may be some aspects of it that might be of interest to the general public.
Very good. We'll be back again in a moment with Jorge Heine. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Modern diplomacy.
Yes.
So how does that differ from pre-modern diplomacy or
Yes.
old-style diplomacy?
Of course. Well, the basic distinction that we make in the book, and I have a chapter on that, is what we call the shift from club to network diplomacy. And it is our contention that what we have seen over the past 30 years, basically, I would place it at the start of globalization, which some people date in 1980 with the emergence of CNN for the first time and with the first PC. And what does that mean? It means that diplomacy has shifted from being handled by a small group of people, basically diplomats who interact with their counterparts in the government, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and perhaps a businessman or two, and with their colleagues in the diplomatic corps, but not really much beyond that. And that was the traditional approach, which is, of course, rooted in the Renaissance Italy, and then in the French and British courts in the 17th and 18th century. And there's a tradition of basically the diplomat as courtier. Now, what we say...
Sir Henry Wotton said, I believe, that an honest man sent to lie abroad for the good of his country.
That's right. There are variations on that. Some of them refer to boudoir diplomacy, which has taken this one step further. And our contention is that this has changed drastically. And I had the chance to see this in South Africa. I arrived there in April '94, when shortly before the elections. And once President Mandela was elected and took office, the South African government went into the process known as transformation. Needless to say, that meant that many of the old rules didn't apply. And I remember seeing many of my colleagues being rather desperate because they didn't know what to do. There was no counterpart in the foreign ministry with whom they could interact on a regular basis because things were changing very quickly. I, on the one hand, with my background as a political scientist, was fascinated by the process of change that was taking place in South Africa, and told myself, well, the action is elsewhere. You have to look at what is happening in society rather than just look, at government. And well, something similar happened to me in India later. I was in India from 2003 to 2007 when India was opening up. Again, changing many of the parameters under which India had operated in the old days. And I found much the same. So network diplomacy means that you engage a much broader set of actors: NGOs, trade unions, political parties, the media. The relationship with the media, I find, is a particularly interesting one, because the traditional attitude of diplomats was to stay away from the media because it was a dangerous proposition. If you said the wrong thing, it might cost you a job. If you don't engage them, well, nothing happens. Therefore, it's a safe strategy. Now, my take is that although they may be safe, it is not necessarily the best approach, because it means that you're giving up on much of what builds network diplomacy and ways to reach people. So if you're there to convey what your country is all about, and you do not work with the media, you will be severely limited in the possibilities and the things that you will do. It seems to me that network diplomacy also has a much stronger verbal component, in the sense that you have to engage people. Harold Nicholson famously said that diplomacy is written art, and there's something to it. And obviously, the written word continues to be extremely important. But there is nowadays, on television, and giving speeches around the country, and so on, something which I frequently did, a much stronger verbal component. That what I teach my students in the class on modern diplomacy, I teach at Wilfrid Laurier. I think diplomacy is going back to the days of the Greek city-states, in which the ambassadors had to be great orators. They were sent from Athens to Sparta to speak at the Agora and convey to the citizens' assembly what Athens was up to.
So does this shift from club to network diplomacy change the diplomat from a negotiator to a salesperson?
Well, there is an element of that.
What skill set is now needed that didn't used to be needed?
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, there are several things that change. The way I see it, the traditional sort of functions of diplomacy were to represent, to inform, and to negotiate. The way I see it, network diplomacy means not just represent. Representing has a passive connotation. You represent by being, by standing, by waving the flag, by going to military parades. I mean, all of those things have to be done. But in addition to that, you have to engage the society, the host society in which you are. So I refer to that as projecting your own society upon the host society and conveying what you're all about. And that is, quite different. The information aspect has been diminished to some degree because of the internet, and information today is available instantly at headquarters. So you don't need a long report from the ambassador on the elections that were held 2 days ago. Right. That is instantly available. Now, what you do need, of course, is to inform about what aspects of that election will affect your country. That doesn't appear in the Economist or the Financial Times. So that you have to do. But you don't have to spend many days writing very long cables about these matters. And it's a question of, actually, and finally, the point of negotiating has been diminished somewhat. Nowadays, there are lots of negotiations going on, but they are often taken by technical staff that are specialists in certain topics, and they come especially if you're negotiating a free trade agreement, a preferential trade agreement, whatever. There are specialists that will come, But the real task here, the real test, is to get your country to come to be able to sit at the negotiating table. I mean, once you've reached that stage, it's the technical personnel takes over. But to reach, there are 200 countries around the world. Why should India be interested in negotiating a trade agreement with Chile? When I first mooted that to them, my Indian friends in the government told me, well, first, we don't do trade agreements, number one. Number two, even if we did, why would we negotiate one with Chile? Right. The answer was not obvious. So that's where the diplomat's task comes in,
right.
And convince them that this is something sensible. Once you've done that, well, you bring in the technical personnel, and they will negotiate how many apples can come in a year.
Right.
But to reach that stage, is what diplomats must do, and that is not something that you do just by sitting with some government officials. You have to mobilize.
So the key skill is persuasiveness.
I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very good.
I think there's an element of the salesman that you quite rightly underscored.
Yeah. Very good. We'll be back again in a moment with Jorge Heine. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So you've talked about the information age and the instantaneous availability of ample information.
Right.
I remember Pierre Trudeau once speculated back in the day, I believe it was the early 80s, that maybe we wouldn't need diplomats anymore, and obviously diplomats are still very busy. But when the WikiLeaks affair broke, it struck me that the reactions were quite intriguing. There was a lot of panic, I think, my sense, perhaps.
Of course, yes.
There was also
right. Yes,
that this would fundamentally undermine the institution of diplomacy.
Yes.
From where I sit, that has not happened. It's been a bump in the road, if anything, and maybe that's only because in that grand mountain of information that was leaked, there frankly wasn't much that was very interesting, and most of it actually I read as profoundly insightful. It sort of demonstrated the acuity of people who were saying things behind the closed doors.
Yes.
But I guess there must be that fear in the back of the mind of the diplomat now that in principle almost anything could be on the front page of the New York Times. Is that true in your view? And how does that change the nature of the job?
It is. Well, I said earlier, that there's been this long-standing, almost sacred institution, which is the diplomatic cable, has its origins in the Italian city-states in the Renaissance, when ambassadors were requested to report back to their prince what was happening in Florence to Venice and so on. That's where that originated. And that's where the sort of written skills came in very strongly and stayed with diplomacy for such a long time. Now, I said earlier that this informational need has diminished in the current age. And it seems to me that what WikiLeaks did was an additional piece of damage, if you will, by undermining the confidentiality of it, in the sense that much of the value of the diplomatic cable in today's day and age, to my mind, lies in the fact that you're able to say things you will not find in the press. That's the value added that comes from the diplomatic cable. Now, if those things that you say will appear in the newspaper tomorrow, and we can land you into trouble. There are ambassadors who have been declared persona non grata, as the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador was declared persona non grata and had to leave Quito because of what appeared in WikiLeaks. And the position of the U.S. ambassador to Mexico was also severely undermined, and although he was not formally declared persona non grata, he had to leave Mexico as well because the president said he was not going to meet with him again. So, there have been some quite material consequences of this.
For individual ambassadors.
For individual ambassadors, yes.
But what about for the practice of
diplomacy? Well, what my reading is that people are now, diplomats are now a lot more cautious in terms of what they say, in the sense that what they put in writing, even if it is in a cable, might show up.
And is there more attempt at the setter to manage the messaging? Or is that in the social media age? Is that actually the opposite? That folks in the field and the embassies are liberated in the sense by having access to their own Twitter accounts.
Yes. That's one angle. The other angle, of course, and this goes totally contrary to this trend. You have this extraordinary phenomenon, which is Twitter diplomacy.
Right.
I was under the impression that Twitter was totally unsuited to diplomacy because it's very brief, it's provocative, it aims to be witty, all of things that do not go down very well in the daily practice of diplomacy. Yet, the way I see it, and I've looked at this in some detail, Twitter diplomacy is thriving. So there goes in the opposite, but it's all out in the open, of course. And you have, I don't know whether you know this, but the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, he has, I don't know, something like 40,000 followers. He tweets in Russian and is able to reach directly the Russian people, which is sort of a dream come true for a diplomat. Carl Bildt, the foreign minister of Sweden, is a leading practitioner of Twitter and has I don't know, 150,000 followers, something like that. So that is that goes against the trend that I mentioned earlier. But it's all out in the open, and it seems to me that Twitter diplomacy is in many ways sort of the best expression of network diplomacy. How on the one hand the quickness with which you can use it and the low cost overrides the questions of propriety and whether this might go down well or badly with whoever receives it.
Now, your colleague Paul Heinbecker has written and spoken eloquently on the Canadian retreat from the world stage and has been very critical, among other things, of the Canadian government closing consulates and consolidating missions, even mooting the idea of sharing space with
the United Kingdom,
the British and so on.
Yes.
Is this because of a sense that we don't need to be physically present in all these places anymore in a connected world? And is that really undermining what we can do on the world stage? Or is it a misreading of the technological implications?
Yeah, I would argue it's a misreading. And what I've argued is that it's not just Canada. A number of other countries around the world are doing the same. And the notion is that you can save a lot of money. Now, there's a paradox here. The paradox is the following. Wherever you look throughout the world, foreign ministries have basically the lowest, if not the lowest of all ministries' budget. So you compare it with education, agriculture, health, it's peanuts within the larger scheme of things. So the notion that you can balance the national budget on the back of the foreign ministry is something that's not warranted. That's number one. Number two, I believe very strongly, I saw this firsthand, that with globalization and the increase in flows around the world in FDI, in trade, in tourism, the economic impact of these flows are in so many ways so much higher than in the past that what is at stake is so much more. With one deal for a couple of $100 million for an investment project, you would pay for the yearly budget of a foreign ministry like Chile's. I myself was involved in attracting a $1.7 billion investment from South Africa to Chile, that at the time was the single biggest foreign investment project in Chile ever. And before that, I had trouble convincing my ministry that I should keep my commercial attaché. After that happened, it changed. But the point I'm trying to make is that what is at stake in today's globalized world, is so much. And the notion that by closing a few embassies, you will somehow, make a difference and save a lot of money, is quite unwarranted. Right. Now, what is interesting is that, a number of countries have realized that. A country like Brazil, under President Lula, opened 40 new embassies around the world. A country like Turkey has done the same, so has China. So the emerging powers are realizing this, and they are moving ahead very swiftly and effectively.
Great. Be back one last time with Jorge Heine. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Well, you and I are both officially political scientists, but we know that it's not a predictive science. But I'd still like to ask you to sort of cast your mind ahead 10, 20, maybe even 30 years. And how do you think diplomacy will continue to evolve? We've gone from club to network. What's next?
Well, one of the things I've been told by a number of foreign ministries I have worked with is they have told me, well, start thinking about diplomacy without embassies, you know. And so that is one line of thinking. Basically, you know, you outsource whatever functions are being performed now, and you know, pretend you can do it at a distance using e-media and otherwise perhaps with some local personnel and so on. Well, my own view is that those countries that do that will have taken the wrong path. My own view is that the way globalization is going, the way, you know, economic growth is going, the way opportunities are evolving out there, unless you have a presence on site to make the best of what is on the table, you will not succeed. Let me give you an example. The fastest growing part of the world today is Asia, both East Asia and South Asia. You know, for countries that want to do business there, they want to partake of investment opportunities, they want to do more trade, they want to benefit from tourism. I mean, Asia is very different from what the Americas are, from what Europe is, from Africa. The notion that you can somehow affect these trends at a distance, to my mind, you know, is not grounded in reality. I mean, it is difficult enough to affect them while there. The notion that you could be able to affect them at a distance is even, you know, even weaker. So my sense is that what countries like Brazil and Turkey and China are doing, which is to enhance the potential of its and the reality of its ministry, and putting more people abroad in more missions and making them work, is that will show to be, well, the most effective way, rather than this retrenchment, which, as I say, you know, the numbers are so low that you're not going to balance the budget on that. It's basically, you know, very small amounts of money. So what you save is really not worth it.
Now, the countries that are retrenching,
yes,
are they undermining the attractiveness of the career, and is that lessening the quality of the applicant pool,
well,
people coming into it?
Of course, this is happening. It's happening in the UK. You know, the United Kingdom is retrenching as well. Nowadays, Brazil has more embassies in Africa than the United Kingdom has, which gives you, you know, an impression of what is happening. I would say that in general, the attractiveness of the diplomatic career in many countries, not all, but in many, has diminished, not only because of this cost-cutting element, but also because you know, the possibility of travel, which used to be such an important part of the attractiveness, well, is now much more available to everybody. You know, the fact that you know, nowadays many more women have joined the workforce also means that there is a problem. You know, when the husband travels, well, what will the wife do, or vice versa, of course, with many women joining the diplomatic service. So there are these obstacles, and they have to be considered. Obviously, the quality of the diplomatic personnel, you know, which is one thing I tell my students here at Laurier, is very important. You know, and what this can mean, I was just, as I said, in Trinidad, I was talking to the Chilean ambassador, a very kind, a good friend of mine, very kindly invited me to stay with him at the residence. He was telling me that he started his career sort of upside down. He was sent as a 30-year-old third secretary to South Korea in the 80s. And for some reason, the ambassador that was there was sent back to Chile. And he was the only diplomat. And he was chargé d'affaires, head of mission, at the Chilean embassy in South Korea for about a year. Now, here he was sort of thrown to the wolves at a very young age. And, you know, he's one of our best diplomats and he's done a very good job. One of the reasons was, you know, he suddenly saw himself with this challenge, you know, and he had to make do.
Rise to it. Now, you said the diplomacy is a craft.
Yes.
Is it one you can learn, or do you have to have a certain native skill set?
Well, no, I would say you need a combination of the two. It seems to me if you do not like to engage people, if you do not like to go out in the evenings, if you'd rather stay home, then you're in the wrong business and you should do something else. You need to be able to engage people, and you need to have a certain sort of degree of spirit of adventure, if you will, to go out to the world and do what is needed. People would often ask me, well, what does it take to be an ambassador? I say, well, walk into a room of 100 people, you don't know anybody. And, well, somehow you must meet and greet. Now, not everybody has that spirit, and some people find it very difficult. So that goes, if you will, that will be part of personality. But then, of course, there are many aspects of this craft that can and must be learned. How to write the diplomatic cable, different procedures of protocol, various aspects of negotiation, and so on and so forth. But I would put at the very center of it people skills, and that again is a combination of what you bring with you and what you can learn.
Have you had any indication from anywhere that there's interest in the book, in part because it could be helpful for training?
Very much so. There was a very good reaction among the Trinidadian heads of mission with whom I met a couple of weeks ago in Port of Spain, also with the members of the resident diplomatic corps in Port of Spain. So my sense is that there is tremendous interest out there for something like this. This is I call it the most ambitious publishing venture in diplomatic studies today. So we hope it makes quite a splash.
Well, I hope so too. And congratulations to you and your co-editors.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming again to speak with us about this important topic. And thanks to the audience for joining us. And please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jorge Heine on modern diplomacy. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Paulsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my great pleasure every week to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation some noted expert on some aspect of international affairs, international public policy, global governance, and today I'm pleased to welcome back my friend and colleague Jorge Heine.
Thank you.
Who's the CG Chair of Global Governance, Professor of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University, and also distinguished fellow here.
Was opening up. Ramesh was at the United Nations University for many years, and Andrew Cooper, of course, one of the leading writers on diplomacy, and has been examining it from many angles for many years. And it struck us that the enormous changes that we are seeing in the practice of diplomacy and the demands of globalization weren't really always being met by the way diplomats practice their craft, nor by the way the practice of diplomacy is taught at diplomatic academies around the world. So we thought it was a good idea to put together in one standalone volume insights into how this very ancient and traditional craft is changing and has been changing over the past 20 or 30 years or so. So that is one source of these changes. The other source comes from our experience here at CG and our work on the G20. It so happened that the three of us were associated with CG from the very...
We're at CG, and today we're talking about modern diplomacy because you and your colleagues Andrew Cooper and Ramesh Thakur are about to come out momentarily with a new book called The Oxford Handbook of Modern Diplomacy, a very ambitious effort. So before we talk about modern diplomacy, perhaps we could talk about the book, the Handbook of Modern Diplomacy.
Of course, and of course you have a very good chapter in it on the diplomacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, let me say the following. What triggered this project, which is the biggest publishing project I've ever been involved in 50 chapters, nearly 1,000 pages. It's a big doorstopper, if you will. There are two sources of this book, if we want to trace them. One of them was the experience of the three of us, Andrew Cooper, Ramesh Thakur, and myself, from our own different professional capacities, in terms of how we saw diplomacy changing. I was lucky to be ambassador in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was president, and later in India when India was beginning. And we were lucky enough to be mandated by Paul Martin shortly before he became prime minister with the task of spreading the word about the G20 and what the G20 could do if it was established at leaders level. Paul Martin, of course, had been the first chair of the G20 at finance ministers level as far back as in 1999. And he was very keen to make it happen at leaders level. So he tasked CG to do that, and we all took part very much in that. It was a fascinating experience. A lot of people were skeptical, and they said, this will never happen. The United Nations Security Council will be changed before there is a G20 at leaders level. The United States is not interested. President Bush in particular is adamantly opposed to these so-called talk shops. So it will never happen, don't waste your time. And at the time, I was coming to CG to meetings of the International Board of Governors and going back to Delhi where I was ambassador of Chile and mentioned this to my colleagues, and they said, Jorge, why do you waste your time? This will never happen. Well, lo and behold, as we all know, in November of 2008, it was President Bush himself who called for the first G20 meeting to be held in Washington, D.C. So we were struck by the importance of ideas and how ideas can actually change the way the world is run. And we were keen to look in greater detail into the interaction between ideas on the one hand and praxis and the sort of things you need to do to operationalize these ideas in global governance and in diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. And you've got both scholars and practitioners represented.
That's right. One of the things we wanted to do, this book is part of the Oxford Handbooks in Political Science and in International Relations, which is a very notable series. But one of the things we wanted to give this book is our imprint in the sense of not being just having scholars and academics participate, but also bring the perspective of practitioners. So we were lucky enough to have chapters by Paul Martin himself,